Morning, Elvis.
Now, the Greeks became the very first developed country to default on the IMF loan repayment. What does that mean for the Greeks?
Well, I think the starting point should be, Elvis, that when one thinks about the Greek situation, I'm reminded of a remark which a leader of the opposition in Britain made a few years ago when he was criticizing the then government on its economic policies very heavily. So the media said to him, but, what would you do in this situation? He says, I wouldn't have got myself into it in the first place. And I think when one talks about the EU, the IMF and the Greeks, you said, well, how did you get yourself into the situation? But that's where you are now.
Yes.
And this referendum is, of course, quite decisive. We must recall, though, that this has been a long and slow-burning fuse. This is not something that's happened overnight. It has culminated over a few years.
Take us back to those years.
Well, it goes back probably to the formation of the euro currency, where perhaps there were structural defects in the sense that there was so much enthusiasm, we have a good common market, isn't the next step to have a common currency? Without asking, are all the conditions in place for a common currency, given the increasing membership of the EU? And of course, Greece has been a member for a long time, but perhaps at that point, that structural weakness then became quite evident when you took on board certain economies that probably would not be able to comply to the extent that they should. It's fine to have one central bank, but you can't just have one monetary union and not a fiscal union. You can't have 20 ministers of finance doing their own thing under a single currency and not expect something will go wrong. And I think already then there were some early warning signals about Greece. And as Greece then got money through the EU and through the whole Eurozone facilities, that money has been largely dissipated in a current account deficit, in fiscal deficits. And so now you've ended up in a huge debt trap, which has caused a lot of pain to everyone and has tested the patience of the EU. And I actually think you're looking at a situation where there's enough blame now to go around for everyone. Now it has to be sorted out. And hopefully the referendum on Sunday will give a clear direction, either yes or no, each one which has its implications and each one has huge risks.
Let's talk about those implications. If they vote no, what will happen? And if they vote yes, what then?
Well, let's start with the yes, because it's like being between the devil and the deep blue sea. So let's start with the devil. Yes. That means you've got to go back to the creditors, the EU, the IMF, and you will have to negotiate. You will have to then accept perhaps less favorable terms. There will be more austerity. The recession in Greece will continue until such point as you can get growth going again. But you've got to get your finances in order, and you'll have to make some painful further adjustments to things like pensions, the size of the public sector, all that kind of thing. That is, if you vote yes, you must accept. You must then take a deep breath and say, well, we're going to take some further bad, strong medicine. If you say no, that's the deep blue sea. Now, that's more of an uncertainty in the sense that you would then be cutting yourself loose from the EU, or a process would start whereby that would happen. And, of course, from the common currency, you would have to then go on with the capital controls which they've imposed. You might have to tighten them up. You would then print money. You would then print your own money to replace the euro, which means that you would have to create or recreate the drachma. Probably there would be a devaluation, quite a substantial one, and you'd have to then ask yourself the question, but are the conditions in Greece such that they can benefit from a devaluation, as you had in the case of Argentina a few years ago, where they were able to successfully manage themselves out of a similar situation with, among other things, a big devaluation. I think the question mark about the deep blue sea is, if you cut yourself loose and want to do your own thing, what are the costs of doing that, and are you sure of success? So I think that's the dilemma that has driven this division in the Greek population between desperation and defiance. What do we do, yes or no?
Damn if you do, damn if you don't.
That's the way it seems, yes.
Now, what can we expect from the referendum then this coming Sunday? What do you see?
Well, I think what the surveys are saying is it could well be a close-run thing. Unfortunately, because you're in this acute situation, I just feel that a 51-49 outcome, either way, well, it's an outcome and you'd have to act on it. But quite clearly that wouldn't be ideal as much as a decisive majority one way or the other. Mm-hmm. If the vote is yes, there will also be political consequences because the present government has already said they don't want a yes vote, which also creates a problem because how do you then negotiate with a government that has taken that stance once you've got the outcome of the referendum either way? So there may well be political consequences. Mm-hmm. And of course, the EU itself will then have to deal with these stresses and strains. It's not good news for the EU to have this kind of problem because it sends out a very bad signal. But it will have to be managed because the markets will be looking very carefully, and that includes our currency. We will depend on what the markets do. Mm-hmm. If the markets take the outcome in stride and there's a limited contagion and it can be contained, then the rand will take it in its stride. But if not, then of course we'll have to watch very carefully once the outcome is there, what then will be the actual impact on Europe and on the global markets. How will they interpret that decision?
Mm-hmm. Now, the Greeks also offered fresh proposals and requested an extension to the repayment of that IMF loan of 1.5 billion rand. But why does it seem, Professor, that the creditors are inflexible and reluctant to accept the Greeks' request?
Well, I think there were mistakes made, but you know the trouble is you can't go back. These have been tough negotiations, difficult because you had a new government coming in on an anti-austerity program. That meant they were quite far apart. And what has happened, and I think what has bedeviled the situation also, has been that there hasn't been trust. It's been broken down progressively in the last few months. So much so that one might have thought, well, if it was only a question of a week to the referendum, why not extend the facilities for another week and then see what the outcome is? Mm-hmm. But the fact is that on the 30th of June, everything was terminated in spite of the fact that there was going to be this political test. Mm-hmm. But that was more symptomatic to me of the breakdown in trust, that the creditors felt that their patience was exhausted. But as I said earlier, if you really unpack this, there's enough blame to go around for everyone. Now, there was a comparison partly this week in terms of the Greece economy and the South African economy. But what lessons can we learn from the Greek fallout? Well, let's start by saying that South Africa is not Greece, but we have the challenges of unemployment, poverty and inequality, and we are grappling with those. Three things come out to me. The first is, when you do not have economic growth like Greece, you see the magnitude of the problems. Mm-hmm. Growth is not an answer to everything, but it's better to have it than not to have it. And I think the Greece situation, another classic example of what can happen when you haven't got the growth with which you want to do all sorts of things, including your tax revenues and being able to handle your debt and so forth. The second issue is that the problems of Greece go back several years. As I said earlier, they took certain fiscal choices that were not very sound, which eventually caught up with them. So I say also that when we hear Minister Neni saying, look, I worry about the deficit, we must contain the public sector wage bill, I hear a resonance. He's saying, look, let's take some prudent fiscal discipline now and get our house in order, rather than have to put up with drastic financial austerity later because you've allowed a situation on the debt front to get out of control. So that's a strong message and an important message. So we're still in a position to do the right thing, to keep our debt under control as a nation, and to get the growth we want in order to address the things that we would like to do. So the important message is we are in a strong position to do the right thing on the fiscal front. Don't let what goes wrong on the fiscal front undermine your other goals. And that's a very important message for South Africa and for other emerging markets who want to do better than they're doing at the moment. Professor, as usual, thank you so much for joining us here in studio. Thank you very much. That was Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest Business School joining us here in studio. That is the Greek message. The referendum is on Sunday, and we will be watching that with bated breath. But right